Speaking of babies being born, in Los Angeles in 1904, two very happy parents gave birth to a beautiful child. The mother was an Irish-American mother who worked as a teacher. The father was a Japanese poet. And they lived in Los Angeles, and they named their child Isamu Noguchi. And it was a rather unfortunate time to be a kind of biracial family because race laws in the United States were getting significantly worse. The focus then was mainly on Chinese Americans who were accused of stealing American jobs. But following Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War, business leaders in San Francisco created a Japanese and Korean exclusion league to warn Congress that Asians were stealing American jobs. There were anti-Japanese riots in the streets, and the parents of this little child decided it too. It would be better if he moved to Japan. And he lived there until he was 13, and he returned to the Midwest to go to high school. And then he went on to Columbia University, where he began to study medicine. And it was clear that Isamu was not going to be a doctor, but his mother encouraged him to attend a local art school in the East Village. And it was there that Noguchi discovered his vocation, that he was a sculptor. And this path, this vocation, this discovering of his identity was not an easy path for him, as we will find out. And yet he becomes one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. And at its heart of this journey was the issue of identity. And that theme is running through our readings this morning. And although he defended and promoted America's noble concept of the melting pot, he struggled all his life to prove that he was a good person, he was a loyal American, and a prophetic artist, expressing what it means to be a spirit-filled, creative human being. On December the 7th, 1941, he is driving from Los Angeles to San Diego to pick up art supplies, a road that I know very well. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And on the left, you have this beautiful California wilderness, mountains going up into the country. And on the right, you have the glistening Pacific Ocean. And it is in that context that he hears that Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor. And he's looking to the Pacific. He's caught between, and he wrote in his autobiography, "With a flash, I realized I was no longer the sculptor alone. I was not just American, but Nisei, 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 a Japanese American." And so the US goes to war with Japan. He identifies very much more than ever with the American cause, and he becomes determined to prove the patriotism of Japanese Americans. And he once wrote, "Maybe they think that race hatred is good for the war spirit," as he's responding to how the government is, particularly through propaganda. He says, "Maybe they are right, but it is very sad." And it was interesting that he found himself as this brilliant emerging artist who was creating pieces of art for some of the most famous people and companies in the United States. And he found himself kind of caught between, and yet 110 to 120,000 of his fellow Japanese Americans were being interned. And he decided, as he lived into this new identity of the Nisei, that he needed to bring art and culture and training to his community. And he did a remarkable thing. He self-interned himself. He went to one of the camps in Arizona, in Poston, to try to make that camp a place where people could still have life and quality of life and training. And he was a kind of bridge between the government and what was going on as the War Relocation Authority created these camps. And he found himself, he walked in the desert, wrote to friends, did what he could, and generally despaired. And when he tried to get out of the camp, he was exhibited in the San Francisco Art Museum in July 1942, and he realized he couldn't get out. He couldn't even attend his own art show. And he said, "A haunting sense of unreality, of not quite belonging, which has always bothered me, made me seek for an answer among the Nisei." He adds, "I begin to see the peculiar tragedy of the Nisei as that of a generation of transition accepted neither by the Japanese nor by America, a middle people with no middle ground." And by the end of the war, when his name was finally cleared, he wrote, "I was finally free of all causes. I resolved henceforth to be an artist only." And in 1986, 2 years before his death, he represents the United States at the Venice Biennale. In an interview conducted in 1973, he says, "For one with a background like myself, the question of identity is very uncertain. And I think it's only in art that it was ever possible for me to find any identity at all." And there's a wonderful article, some of you may have seen in the New Yorker in January, that documents this amazing story of this artist as a person. And I was thinking of that story as I was reflecting on today's readings, because here you have a man who is trying to figure out who he is. Who am I? And why am I here? What is it that I'm contributing to this society that's giving me and people like me a difficult time? And I tell this story because as we look at what's happening in America today, we're kind of asking ourselves in different ways the same question: who are we? What are the things that we value about being Americans and being human beings in the context of what's going on around us today? A friend of mine who's now in her 80s, she remembers living in California, and one day this Japanese-American friend of hers was in her classroom, and the next day that child was gone. And it's interesting that here you have somebody who wasn't directly involved, but this troubled her all her life until the present day. So it's not just about the impact that these injustices have on the victims, but it is the pervasive effect that it does to the whole of society. It's like those oil bubbles that come from the unconscious of the ocean and bubble up, and they're toxic sludge on the top of the sea that affects all of us. The dirty little secrets. And we a couple of weeks ago in Genesis, we had dirty little secrets of Joseph's family, right? We uncovered those dirty little secrets of what happened to Joseph, and then it's repaired, and his family are welcomed and reconciled. They share in his success in Egypt. And today's Genesis reading, all of that's forgotten. All of that's forgotten, and there's a new Pharaoh, and there's a new state policy towards the people that kind of saved Egypt. Amnesia has kicked in. And the Hebrews become their Hebrew Egyptians. They are the in-between people, and they become the scapegoats for this Pharaoh who needs to create the enemy. They're taking over our country. They're going to support the enemy. We have to contain them, and there's a 3-point policy from the state. One is we're going to make them work harder. We're going to build these kind of royal centers, make bricks without straw, work harder. That doesn't seem to be working, and so they recruit the public health sector. Okay, your job is to make sure that Hebrew males are killed. And that doesn't work either. And so the state then says it's up to every patriotic Egyptian to kill male Hebrews. We've got to protect our country. And that doesn't seem to be working either. And it's fascinating that the hero, the people who seem to be holding the moral compass in this very kind of relevant story are the women. It's the women. The midwives play a really important role in saving this little group of people, the slave group of Hebrews that God is promising to honor and protect and be a light to the nations. And the midwives play this game. It's interesting how they're playing a double game. It's a kind of secret game. They're dealing with Pharaoh's own racism. Well, why aren't you killing off all these kids? Well, these women, they're having babies like rabbits. They just pop out. We can't get there in time. And they're appealing to his own racism. And they're not going to participate in ethnic cleansing. But they're leading a double life. And the other piece of this story that's amazing is that even Pharaoh's daughter cannot agree with what her father is doing. It is the ultimate civil disobedience that she recognizes this baby is a Hebrew, and she arranges to have it cared for. What an amazing... So the women saved the day. It's interesting, if Pharaoh, if he was really smart, he would have said, go for the women. Leave the guys alone. And it's the women who allow this amazing protection and relationship of God to move forward. And the person of Moses, I used to think that, Moses was picked out of the basket and he becomes this royal prince and he's privileged and everything. No, that's not the story. He continues to be reared as a Hebrew. He's given back to his family. And his mother gets an income and protection from the royal household. And when he's older, he then is adopted by the princess. So Moses is an in-between person. Very interesting. That he's like Noguchi. And maybe in his own struggle with the identity question, he understands what it means to be a bridge between humanity and God. And he has to live that out in his life. And he would have understood the comment from Noguchi. For one with a background like myself, the question of identity is very uncertain. And I think it's only in art that it was ever possible for me to find an identity at all. In other words, Noguchi found his vocation as an artist to express the divine calling, his purpose, his gospel without words. And so much of Noguchi's work is about the holding together of opposites. And it might be water and rock. And showing a kind of yin-yang, how that is a part, and that opens up a whole different way of seeing life. And the question of identity that I'm exploring in the Old Testament reading is also present in the Matthew reading. And the gospel ends with this veil of secrecy, rather like the kind of double life that the midwives are leading. Shh, don't tell anybody. And when Matthew's gospel was written, it would have been after the savage destruction of Jerusalem. The temple was gone. Everything that was important to the Jews was either destroyed or reformed. And Rome had to have complete control over this rebellious, divided Jewish people. And some people in church, one of the book clubs read the book Zealot by Reza Aslan this past year. And in the book Zealot, we discovered that there was basically a Messiah of the month. Basically, somebody put the flag up, I'm the Messiah. And the idea of Messiah was not only politicized, but it was militarized. The Messiah had to be a warrior who was going to get rid of these Romans. So when Peter is saying to Jesus, there's a part of us that think, oh, how smart of Peter. you're the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus probably went, oh no, no I'm not. Oh, you're right. Right answer, but wrong interpretation. And then they started listing all these dead people. Oh, some say you're John the Baptist, he's gone. Elijah, Jeremiah, all of who had a very hard time with authority. And Jesus is going, oh no, I need more time to convince these guys that the Messiah thing is very different. It's not about peace. It's not about, violence is going to achieve the ends that we want. It's about reconciliation. And it's about how do I create a community that sees itself as the in-between people. Right? And you get this lovely articulation of that in the Romans reading today. Paul has this idea that if the toe hurts, we're in pain. We're all connected. We're like a body. And how do we start to see that in discovering our vocation, it is not in conflict what everybody else is about, and that there's something happening that's wonderful and purposeful and is filled with the light and the love of God. I remember when I became an American citizen, it's actually a legal ceremony. There were a couple of thousand of us in a convention center in San Diego, and you're sworn in by a judge. It's a legal ceremony. And the judge that swore us in told a wonderful story. He said, I'm married to a Japanese woman. And she was very concerned that when she would become an American citizen, that she would have to deny and forget her Japanese roots and her culture. And he said, that's the wrong way to think of what it means to be an American. And he told us in that room, he said, we need what you're bringing to this country. We need your experiences and your insight, because if this little experiment of America is going to be a light to the nations, we have to learn to be this one body. And in a way, he was saying, in a secular way, the same thing that Paul was saying. And that humanity has an opportunity to think differently about itself. And that the identity question that's running right through our readings is central to this kind of discovery of vocation that Noguci, as an artist, discovered. So last week, I was playing hooky. Mili and I were in New York. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there is a beautiful installation by Noguci that some of you may have seen. And it was put in just 2 years, I think, before his death. And it's called Water Stone. And me, as a religious person, it looks like a font. It's not a font, but it's a basalt rock. And the top of it is like glass smooth, and there's a hole in it, and water is coming out and seeping over 7 sides. Some of the sides are smooth, and some of them are rough. And it's sitting on a base that is surrounded by granite stones from Japan's most sacred Shinto shrine. And it's this amazing. In the middle of all the cacophony of people in the museum, you have this garden of serenity, that the water is flowing over these stones, kind of timeless. And I found on YouTube, there's actually a 9-minute film. It's interesting, of the actual installation with staff from the Met and Noguchi, telling them they're doing it wrong, putting the thing in. And it's so touching and so powerful. But this is a way in which he is expressing what it means to be this in-between person. And I also discovered that there is a whole museum to Noguchi in Queens that I haven't visited yet. So we have to have a field trip. But I find in this story enormous wisdom as I read through the story of Moses. And I hadn't thought of Moses before being this in-between person. And how he is a kind of prophetic figure. He is the person that Jesus becomes and who opens up opportunities that we can't imagine for humanity to move forward. I want to end with a poem. Noguchi's father was a poet, and I wanted to find out a little bit about, the kind of poetry that Noguchi might have heard as a child. And I found this wonderful poem, and as a Christian, the poem, to me, is like the transfiguration of Jesus. It is about light, it's about humanity transformed. It's very short. Out of the deep and the dark, a sparkling mystery, a shape, something perfect, comes like the stir of the day, on whose breath is an odor, whose eyes show the road to stars, the breeze on his face, the glory of heaven on his back. He steps like a vision hung in air, diffusing the passion of eternity. His abode is the sunlight of morn, the music of eve, his speech. In his sight, one shall turn from the dust of the grave and move upward to the woodland. Amen.